This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/audio.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com, or you can just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show today, be sure and check out our Patreon, where we put up exclusive content every month, about 8 hours of new content, but a lot of free stuff too. I put up free content there all the time. You should check it out every day and see what I'm putting up there. But our archives are always free. You can find them at Spreaker.com. You go to Spreaker.com, you sign up for free. You get an email notification anytime we put up new content. And there's a chat room you can keep in touch with other listeners. We have today coming to us from Richard Kerr. Our guest today comes to us from Richard Kerr, who came on the show here and told us about his experience with the Kincora School for Boys over there in Northern Ireland, way back during the Troubles, back in the 70s. And Richard told us a story about how he was actually targeted by Roy Cohen, President Trump's former attorney. Today we have Donald Lavery, who is a Irish commentator and writer. He's local to Northern Belfast. And he's written a book called The Demon Doctor, British Intelligence and Child Sexual Abuse. Mr. Lavery, are you there?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, my friend. Tell us, who is Donald Lavery?
Well, he's many people, but essentially, in a literal sense, a local commentator in North Belfast. I also I've published one book already, and basically, I was a close friend of the late journalist Lyra McKee. You'll probably have seen it on the news that she was shot to death here. She had been writing about the issue of Kincora Boys Home prior to me. But we would have met each other prior to Lyra's killing. And she was killed in Derry in Ireland. And basically, she had been writing extensively about the issues relating to Richard Kerr's time at this particular facility and some of the people involved, including state agents and actors.
Wasn't she also reporting on Jimmy Savile?
She was doing some work on it, yeah.
Okay, then I am familiar with that story. Now, her death, what was the conclusion of that? Was there an investigation to find out what was the circumstances around her death?
She was basically, there has never actually been a successful prosecution for her murder. Even though such high-profile people were at her funeral, like the British and Irish Prime Ministers and so forth. Her death, basically, she was in a crowd of people in a city called Derry, and she was taking coverage of rioting that was taking place. And a gunman mysteriously appeared, dressed all in black, and opened fire. They said they opened fire at police, but it specifically hit her in the head. It didn't hit any police officers, which people find a bit unusual, especially given that happened a number of years ago, and there still isn't any advances in terms of bringing anyone before a court of law over it.
Fascinating. And you said you wrote a previous book. What was your previous book written about?
The previous book was written about how a young boy called Noah Donoghue of mixed race mysteriously went missing back in June of last year in Belfast. He actually went missing on Father's Day and was found 6 days later naked and dead in a storm drain facility underground something out of Stephen King's novel It. And basically there had been no proper police investigation or anything at the time. And when we compared that really with previous cases that had taken place in England, Scotland, Wales, you find that really it was a question of the fact that he was, first of all, he was an Irish Catholic, but also he was mixed race. His father lives in Boston. What we were doing was comparing the double standard in that book with just similar sort of cases and how long it took for the discovery of the child's body. That's an ongoing legal matter in that the inquest still hasn't actually determined the cause of death yet, but there's more evidence emerging just really as time passes in relation to the suspicious nature of it.
So this is a particular area of interest to you, these children, abused children, finding justice for these kids?
Well, I had been writing the Kincora book first, and basically the circumstances happened with Noah. I was actually in hospital having surgery and convalescing after it, and so that's kind of why one book was paused to give precedence to the other, so to speak. But the thing about what struck me in terms of the similarity between the two was that there was a young boy called Brian McDermott, and Richard Kerr has given evidence in relation to this to the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry. But his body was found in the River Lagan in Belfast, cut to pieces in the 1970s, 1973, if I remember correctly. And he obviously had been murdered. People speculated that there had been some form of Satanism involved in it. And one of the people who had been sexually abusing young boys like Richard at Kincora, numerous sources had linked him to that child's death, but he himself was an ex-cop. And his brother was particularly senior, if I recall, in the Special Branch, which is the political arm of police in Northern Ireland. So there was conflicts of interest, so to speak, and just when you look at some of the material that was submitted to the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry, that child's death, Richard seems to be one of the few people who's actually come forward with an explanation as to what occurred. I mean, all these years later, the police tried to pin it on his brother, who was a teenager at the time, but have never actually been able to bring charges against him, and have tried to get him to sign things like forced confessions. And it really destroyed the lives of the family. But I don't for a second believe that it was Brian McDermott's brother. I do believe that the link was to Kincora, and I particularly would note that the Director of Public Prosecutions here was not only aware about Kincora in the 1970s before the scandal broke, but had been served a report about how one of the abusers connected to Kincora was linked to that particular murder, and they buried the report and didn't prosecute.
Yeah, I believe I had one of those gentlemen on the phone.
Similar to the district attorney in America.
Yeah, I believe I had that gentleman on the phone on the show here. I think we interviewed him because Richard sent over about a half a dozen people, Colin Wallace and a whole bunch. Why don't you describe to us? Yeah, go ahead.
No, Colin wasn't the Director of Public Prosecutions in relation to it. Colin was a British Army intelligence officer who tried to blow the whistle on the Kincora Boys Home scandal. And he ended up with a body in a trunk, and it was stitched up. But he became aware of the corruption that was going on in relation to this, and how, just like with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, the home was being used to compromise prominent people.
Yeah, I believe Colin did 8 years on that and got out, hit the ground and run, and didn't miss a beat. Why don't you describe to us what it was like politically in Northern Ireland around the time of this Kincora Boys scandal?
Okay, well, in 1969, the conflict in Northern Ireland had broken out. And that essentially was a bit sort of like the civil rights era in America, in that, Irish Catholics in the North were treated in a discriminatory way. The British state, the policing system in the North was corrupt and very anti-Catholic, and so there was no confidence in policing whatsoever, either from the Irish government in the south of Ireland or indeed from the Catholic community in the north. So the British government then of Harold Wilson at the time, they had to send the British Army in to police the streets. And it became very militarised in the sense that it was a war zone. And the government that had existed in Northern Ireland prior to that, which was a one-party unionist Protestant government, so to speak, that had been abolished by the government in London because it was under the UK jurisdiction. And what happened was these direct rule ministers from London, so essentially English MPs, were being sent in to govern this part of Ireland. So what you had was a war zone, and you had the IRA, who were essentially fighting a war to overthrow the British presence in Ireland and reunify the country. You had, on the right-wing side of things, you had the Ulster Loyalists, who were fighting a counterinsurgency war to try and remain a part of the United Kingdom, or some of them actually wanted an independent Northern Ireland. And they would be very closely associated with events that were happening at Kincora. Many of their leaders and stuff were involved in child sexual abuse there, and so it was Kincora. The abuse that was going on there was being used as leverage and political blackmail over them. Anytime the British government needed them to do things, or needed them to bend the knee, or wanted them not to do a certain course of action, they could use that information against them.
Yeah, people not familiar. This Northern Ireland is like the size of Connecticut in the United States. Very small geographical piece of land there. And at this time, there was not just the famous bombings that were going on that was making the news all over it, but there were kidnappings, shootings, beatings all the time. It was just a chaotic disruption of a natural life there, horrible living conditions. And the Kincora School for Boys was just like, at first, like a legitimate school for orphans or young boys. What was the deal with that?
Essentially, it was a care facility for those who were under the oversight of the state, and the welfare was being taken care of, so to speak, by state personnel. It was a children's hostel / home facility in East Belfast, and it housed around, probably about 24 boys at most, and basically it had been in existence for several decades prior to the actual scandal erupting.
And why don't you describe for us some of the abuses that were going on there?
Oh God, that's a long list. But in terms of, there was horrific child sexual abuse of all variants. But essentially what you had was civil servants from London in Whitehall, as well as members of the judiciary in Northern Ireland. You had security service chiefs, such as Maurice Oldfield, as well as other figures like Lord Mountbatten, the Queen's cousin, Prince Philip's uncle, who were involved in the sexual abuse and trafficking of young boys, including to Lord Mountbatten's stately home in County Sligo in the Republic of Ireland, which is where he was murdered by the IRA, allegedly. But essentially it was a misuse and abuse of power over those who are vulnerable to an unprecedented scale at the time in Western Europe. And you had at the centre of it all this mysterious psychiatrist who's still alive, by the way.
Oh, really?
He's living in the Yes, he's living in the Netherlands. His name is Dr. Maurice Fraser, and despite his involvement in Kincora, despite his prosecution in both the US in the early 70s and indeed in London, I think, for child sexual abuse, he was still allowed to go on practicing medicine for years thereafter. And at an investigation into his crimes and malpractice, the Attorney General of Great Britain and Northern Ireland came with him to that investigation. His name was Sir Patrick Mayhew.
Wait. Who went with him?
This happened, as in, when was this?
No, you're saying that some state attorney went with him to represent him?
The highest legal officer in Great Britain, the Attorney General, Sir Patrick Mayhew.
Really? Okay, well, let's back up a little bit. Let's back up a little bit here. Now, Kincora School for Boys.
That's been factually confirmed. That's not my view or anything.
No, sure.
That has been... Yeah.
But I'm interested first in the abuses that were going on at the school. For how many length of years was this going on?
It's hard to say exactly how long it was going on for, to put a time frame on it, but I would be confident in saying perhaps at least 20 years.
20 years, and there was about 24 boys living there at a time. So now, years later, how many of these young boy victims have come forward and say, hey, I was a victim there at Kincora?
It's hard to put an exact figure on that because the thing is there are a lot of victims who don't wish to come forward.
Sure.
There were many who committed suicide. I mean, there were some who gave evidence to the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry, and there were those who felt too intimidated to actually come forward and give evidence at all. So to put an exact figure on it is really quite difficult, but in terms of prosecutions of the staff who were working at Kincora, I think at the time it was something around the best part of 12 boys had mentioned, the 12 boys had given accounts or evidence about varying times that they had been in, when they were actually resident in Kincora, they had given evidence about incidents of sexual assault.
Okay, fascinating.
So
you're talking about 20 years.
It's very difficult to put an exact sort of figure on the number of boys in relation to it all because many people passed through the home and, record keeping was quite primitive back then.
Sure. Now, and you said, too, that this school for boys, where they were taking advantage of these kids, it was also being used by the intelligence agencies.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's for blackmail purposes and also, too, for, I guess, blackmail and extortion, that type of thing?
Yes, and to have political leverage over the people who essentially were abusing them. The home itself was bugged. There were cameras, photographs were being taken, not just of Kincora, by the way, of other facilities, but the boys at Kincora were being trafficked to those other facilities to have sex with prominent people, including Ray Cohn.
Right.
He was one. There were other people involved. There were British members of Parliament. There were members of the judiciary. There were directorial ministers. There were members of British intelligence themselves who had been involved in it. And what you had was a very right-wing element of British intelligence that were running this scheme, you might call it, this operation. And they were doing it to have leverage over the political class in Britain and also in Northern Ireland. And I mean, to this day, there has been no proper, transparent investigation. You'll find that many of the files went missing in relation to it, including after the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry. Many of them are subject to orders by the UK government, which basically states that they'll not be released until the year 2060.
Wow.
When we'll both probably be dead. Yeah. I mean, this relates to something that happened in the scandal broke in around 1980, 1981.
Right, so they want to seal this up for close to 100 years. Now,
Yes.
you mentioned this child psychologist, Dr. Morris Fraser. How did he come on? Psychiatrist, right? Child psychiatrist. Now, how did he come under scrutiny that he was even being accused?
Well, he had, even before the Kincora scandal had actually broken, he had a criminal record of abusing children in both the US and indeed in England. So in terms of the scrutiny itself, what you'll find is that there were children involved. There were children who resided at Kincora who were, like Richard, who were sexually abused. Richard was sexually abused by him 2 years before to him being assigned to Kincora. But basically, there was a pattern of behaviour in relation to it, and numerous people started to come forward with allegations about how he had been abusing them, including from a well-known children's hospital in Belfast. It's called the Royal Victoria Hospital for Sick Children. He was allowed to continue practicing medicine after that, and he had connections so far up to the British cabinet whereby that particular incident that I mentioned to you about were at the investigation by the General Medical Council into his crimes and malpractice against children as a child psychiatrist. The most senior legal officer in Great Britain, the Attorney General, went to the investigation with him and made representations on his behalf. That's astonishing.
That, and I'm surprised that all the guests I've had on this topic, no one's ever mentioned that to me before. So he's has not been brought to any kind of justice for his activities.
No.
Okay.
No, not concerning the activities that were going on at Kincora. In fact, he wasn't even questioned at the state inquiry that happened just a number of years back into it.
Okay.
He wasn't brought forward as a witness.
And you said he's alive today?
He is alive. He's living in the Netherlands, yep.
Netherlands, right? You mentioned that before. Netherlands, by the way, too, is a place. Netherlands, isn't child pornography legal over there?
Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, in the Netherlands, either the Netherlands or Amsterdam, child pornography is legal.
Yes, it's a much more lax environment.
Yeah.
You'll find than other European countries. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, fascinating.
The age of consent, in the UK and Northern Ireland is 16.
Okay.
The age of consent in some other European countries can be as low as 14.
Yeah, in the Vatican, it was 12 for quite a long time. They just raised it. It used to be 12 years old in Vatican City, 12 years old, age of consent.
I think it's 14 in France, still.
Fascinating. Now,
yeah.
This child psychiatrist, Mr. Morris Fraser.
Yeah, Dr. Fraser, yeah.
Dr. Fraser, is there any speculation that he has connections to British intelligence?
Absolutely. I mean, in 2015, there was a study by an academic which revealed that there were files about Morris Fraser which the British state were not prepared to release on grounds of national security. Now, our freedom of information culture here would not be as well established as yours. Yours dates back to the 60s and the 70s, whereas the Freedom of Information Act in the UK and Northern Ireland didn't actually come into effect until the late 90s. Yeah. So it's not a practice that's quite as well established as that in the US. It's not. I would say that we're not as transparent as America in many respects.
Let me tell you, it's not all that it's cracked up to be here either. You know, like the first couple of times you gotta go to court. You know, they deny it. You know, they black everything out. So it's a battle here too. You know, there's lawyers that specialize in that. You know. Now, there was a historical institutional abuse inquiry, right? Now, did they look into the intelligence connections?
Oh, well, see, that's a very interesting question, because, you see, here's the thing, right? Richard and other boys at Kincora were told that this particular inquiry, which was specific to Northern Ireland in the sense that they would not include Kincora in the UK-wide inquiry that was going on in parallel at the same time, but they restricted the terms of reference so much so that they would not have the inquiry would not have the legal powers to compel witnesses and documents from the intelligence services. So, I mean, imagine a similar inquiry in the U.S. Where the FBI are running this scheme internal in America to get leverage over congressmen, say, and other prominent people. And you could not call those who work at the FBI as witnesses, and you could not compel documentation from them relating to it. Imagine that sort of situation, and then imagine that inquiry being allowed, with those limitations, to conclude that there was no conspiracy involving the intelligence services, despite no cross-examination or due process into them.
Fascinating. Now,
yeah.
Do we know if the American intelligence agencies were aware of this? If Roy Cohn and people like that were involved, they had to be.
Well, that's an interesting point as well, because, I mean, I don't think there's anything that British intelligence really know that American intelligence agencies would not already know. But what I will say is that the FBI certainly kept files in terms of Lord Mountbatten and his perverse appetite for young boys. There were a lot of rumours and speculation when Lord Mountbatten was killed that there may have been some involvement by the CIA in that. I know that it was a subject of some speculation. I would say that the American government, right up until Clinton, always took a sort of hands-off approach to Northern Ireland because they didn't want to offend the British, and Britain was the closest ally of the US in Europe. But when Clinton came into office, he certainly threw his weight, at least behind the Irish peace process. I mean, I'd say that's one of his very few successes as president. But in terms of American intelligence, I think that just generally you'll find that it's one whole perverse network that leads into the other. I mean, these people don't recognize national borders. I don't see any evidence for the fact that there's a real distinction between American intelligence, British intelligence, Israeli intelligence, French intelligence. It doesn't matter which country you're sort of talking about. I mean, if there's a Western sphere of influence, you'll find that the CIA and the FBI know quite a lot. How much they knew about Kincora is, how do you measure? How long is a piece of string?
Yeah.
It's if the British state won't come clean on the extent to which they knew about Kincora, then the American state certainly isn't going to admit to anything.
Yeah, just the amount of NSA surveillance on phones and communications, even at that time was overwhelming. There's no way that they could not have been aware of this. So now, Mr. Lavery, it's funny. We were talking about how the world's intelligence agencies, at least in the West, they're all connected, and they all seem to be up each other's business. Israel and the United States State Department, the British intelligence. Now, we saw that, too, in the Jeffrey Epstein case, too. He had all these connections with Adnan Khashoggi and Israeli intelligence and the U.S. State Department. Did you find any similarities between the blackmail operation going on over there and the Epstein-Maxwell case going on over here?
Indeed. I actually believe that the Mossad and elements within the FBI used the Kincora Boys Home scandal here as almost like a prototype to utilize against prominent individuals in America. I mean, no one would doubt the sway that the Israeli lobby has in America. I mean, that's very substantial. And I mean, I have to distinguish between when I say Israel and Judaism. I don't conflate the two as being one and the same. They're not. But the intelligence services, for example, you'll find that Maxwell, her father, was a British intelligence agent. You'll find that he had very close links to the royal family. And now they're mentioning about the fact that there was suspected or alleged involvement by Prince Andrew in terms of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal that happened. In Kincora, you had royal involvement, but in the form of Lord Mountbatten. You had a lot of these senior intelligence personnel who themselves were also abusing children. You had very senior legal personnel working for the state that were involved, giving them sweetheart deals. I'd say that one of the things that is kind of similar is that Epstein himself died in mysterious circumstances. One of the agents of the state was someone who had agreed to a plea bargain. His name was John McCaig. He was an abuser. And basically what happened was, whenever he was leaving his home to go to the trial, he was shot dead that morning by state agents within a paramilitary organization. Yes, yep. And the interesting thing about that was that McCaig had actually agreed with prosecutors that he would name names of those who were involved in this wider network. And essentially what you had there was the state sacrificing a smaller fish so that the bigger fish could get away. Those who were more valuable to them in their agenda. With Epstein, I understand that there were questions that, he might talk in relation to the staff who were prosecuted for the crimes that were happening at Kincora. What I'll say is that they mysteriously changed their plea from not guilty to guilty the night before the trial. And he was shot dead the morning of the trial.
Now,
there were a lot of very extremely peculiar developments that occurred in relation to that.
Now, the gentleman that was shot, what was the official story of the reason why? If this was police, some kind of law enforcement that shot him, what was the official story why he was shot?
Well, no, see, they stated...
Did I lose you? I think we might have lost our guest here.
That could be true, but the thing is, in the sense that it could have been people who were involved in Irish Republican paramilitaries, but the thing is, the British intelligence ran extensive numbers of agents within Irish Republican paramilitaries.
Wait, just a second, Donald, because we lost your audio there for a second, so it's very important.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I asked you what was the official story of why he was shot. It was my impression that he was shot by law enforcement, so please explain.
Well, they certainly never stated that he was shot by law enforcement.
Okay.
What they stated was that he was shot by basically people connected to the IRA.
Gotcha.
And he was a loyalist. They were saying that it was paramilitary and fighting one side against the other. But actually, with the passage of time, what has emerged is that the people who were involved in his assassination were recruited as agents of British intelligence who were also probably members of Irish Republican paramilitaries.
Let me
that happened. I mean, there are a lot of proceedings going on at the minute in relation to that. I mean, Lyra McKee's book, it mentioned about how one of the IRA, one of the most senior British agents in the IRA, Steak Knife, his code name was, he was alleged to be involved in the murder of an MP who was going to expose much of this.
Let me ask you a question. Are you familiar with a book called Disappeared Off the Face of the Earth by Jim Cairns?
I've heard the name, but I haven't read it.
Okay, it's a fascinating... the book's went out of print, and Mr. Cairns, C-A-I-R-N-S, seems to have gone underground, okay? I had a guest on my show who he couldn't find Mr. Cairns, and he actually republished the book himself on Amazon. I think he was giving it away for free. And then Cairns finally contacted him and told him to cut it out. He was very, very upset and very worried about his own safety. And Mr. Cairns' theory was, and this is right about the same period of time, and all these murders and assassinations that were going on there in Northern Ireland that were being blamed, just like the case you're describing right now, on paramilitary and stuff like that. But he believed that a lot of this stuff going on was due to satanic cults. Now, you mentioned earlier that there was a satanic element to one of these children being murdered. How much... And besides the intelligence agencies, how much of these other things are possible?
I know that's something that was alleged, and it was something that the British security services we're cognizant of that there may have been some sort of satanic involvement in the murder, and also in just further developments generally. But I mean, I try to sort of look at it through the distinction of what you have is really a difference of good and evil, and that these people who are involved in things like Satanism, really what you have is evil people who have evil ideas, and they have perverse appetites, which, I mean, to you and I would seem completely remote, right? But quite a lot of these people at the very upper echelons of society, people like Ray Cohn, people like Dr. Fraser, people like Patrick Mayhew, the former Attorney General, and so forth, they don't have the same morals and standards as ordinary people. You know, the threshold, so to speak, for a thrill and enjoyment in life for them in what I would term the power clique, which let's face it, they're always in power, they're always in office in every country. You know, it's much higher. A lot of, I mean, you look at the stuff that's going on in relation to the Epstein-Maxwell case, right? Look at some of the names that have been touted in relation to that. Look at their prominence in U.S. society. And then, you know, you associate that with the underage, the abuse of underage minors, young, vulnerable people, young people in the U.S., and how the perpetrators of that, like Epstein, got these sweetheart deals that essentially allowed them to evade the justice system. Well, so what you have really is you have two justice systems. You have the justice system for everyone else, and then you have what you call the bourgeois justice system, and that's quite different. I mean, I know Noam Chomsky, the prominent U.S. intellectual. I mean, he often states that in the West, you have not actual democracy, you have a system of bourgeois democracy, and I believe that extends quite thoroughly to the justice system. With Kincora, it's certainly no coincidence that most of these people who were involved in the abuse of children, they were very prominent members of society. They were from a certain class and background for the most part. Not all of them, but for the most part.
Yeah, and we've had similar. I've had a retired police detective, an NYPD detective on this show who made the same allegations about Roy Cohn and his involvement with the same activity here in this country, when at a farm in Connecticut, that they suspected some little boys were buried on. So, anyway, now...
Well, that happened quite a lot in Ireland, but it was more so with the Catholic Church in terms of children's bodies that were buried, particularly in Southern Ireland. There was a whole scandal here called the Mother and Baby Home scandal, but that exposed a similar sort of theme as well. So, I mean, what it shows you is essentially people who have power and how they misuse it in any country.
Yeah, that's interesting. We had a case here, too. I had the guests on the show, the White House Boys, which was, again...
Yes.
You've heard of that. Okay, again, it was a foster home for boys here in the United States. These kids were used as slave labor, and they found a bunch of bodies buried there in their own little graveyard for these little kids, 12 years old. Now, I had some of those young men, now adults, on the show, and they described they would get extensive medical checkups. They said they were starving us. We couldn't get any food. We couldn't get any clean clothes. But we got these medical checkups, man, where they had all this fancy equipment. We got them regularly. Now, anything like that going on over there, too, at Kincora, like a medical experimentation?
That's a very interesting point. And this is something that has been alleged by various survivors, that they were part of a UK Ministry of Defence program of psychological conditioning to make children into boy soldiers. There were similar things happened in Vietnam, for example. You know, Vietnamese women were injected with certain toxins and told to go out and sleep with American soldiers, similar sort of thing. Where humans were used in so-called honey trap operations. That's sort of the Irish and UK terminology for it, a honey trap, that leads the bee or the wasp, more so, to something compromising that's going to ultimately, they're never going to get out of. But, I mean, just really ask me that question again, Ed, though, in the sense that I did have an example of mine there that I was going to tell you about, but I've just forgotten it.
Medical experiments on the kids.
In terms of Dr. Fraser,
yeah.
Now, he, for example, with Richard, when Richard first met him, this is on record. I mean, even the BBC in the UK have admitted this, that when Richard first met him, he basically told Richard to remove his clothing, and he started taking photographs of him. He was, I mean, Colin Wallace and other British Army intelligence officials, they knew that Dr. Fraser had a presence in terms of Ministry of Defence property and bases. There were certainly senior Army and intelligence officials that were uncomfortable with his presence there. They didn't really, some of them knew and didn't want to say. Others were unsure as to why a child psychiatrist was being brought into army territory, so to speak. But it's hard to sort of prove that as concrete. I mean, I know that certainly it's the view of many survivors that from a young age, probably around the age of 8, they were being conditioned and groomed so that they could be used as intelligence operatives to go out and compromise other prominent people. I mean, I remember speaking to one survivor, and what they said to me was that they had been taken into care from such a young age and subjected to horrific treatment by these people, to the point whereby they would be told to go to one particular hotel, which Ray Cohn visited in Belfast, called the Europa Hotel. It was the most bombed hotel in Europe. But what happened was they would be told to go there and perform what was called the elevator trick, which meant that a prominent person would be on the 4th floor and going downstairs, and they would essentially be told, get in the elevator, go upstairs to the 4th floor, let them get in the elevator with you, go downstairs, and then as they're walking out, walk out right next to them and maybe sort of stand right next to them or slightly bump into them, and British intelligence would have someone photographing that, which would allow for that person to be blackmailed, even if nothing was going on, because even if the person was not doing anything that they shouldn't, any malpractice or wrongdoing or criminality against children, essentially what it meant was that they would have a photograph of them standing right next to someone who was either alleged to be a rent boy or alleged to be a child escort of some sort. You know, various terms could be used, but the photographs were used as part of an where the line is drawn between intelligence gathering and a medical experiment by way of psychiatric and psychological conditioning of children. It's hard to sort of distinguish that, because a lot of these files will never be released. So we have to sort of go by what survivors are stating and the information that is currently available, and also wresting further information out of the state in relation to it. But I have no doubt whatsoever that, you know, both of us will be dead before a lot of this information ever sees the light of day.
Now, we only have about 5 minutes left, but I know that the kids in this case received no justice. What does your book recommend that the state needs to do to ensure justice for survivors?
Well, I think legally, there needs to be a process whereby the intelligence services can actually be compelled and cross-examined, and there needs to be prosecutions so that it can't happen again. Now, that's the legal side of it. But if we're going to look at the moral side of it, what we're looking at is essentially one of the things that I believe that would be fitting would be a piece of legislation being passed here in tribute to the victims and survivors that would strengthen the safeguards of children who are in care and afford adequate compensation, medical and treatment services to those who are dealing with the trauma of having lived in the likes of Kincora and been abused. But I don't think that there's any sort of, there is no magic bullet, so to speak, in terms of the recommendations that I'll make. I mean, there's no form of words in my vocabulary that I could find, and I don't imagine I'll ever be able to find them if I searched my entire life, that would be strong enough and potent enough to tell someone who has been molested, abused, sexually assaulted, raped, violated since they were such a young age, say the age of between 5 and 8, right through their teenage years until they become an adult. Nothing is going to take that away. But I think the ultimate sort of reassurance for them is that it would never happen again. And I think, what many of them do want is for there to be proper accountability. And that's where they don't trust the state to deliver that. They'll approach people like myself and provide them with information so that we can write about it and raise awareness of it. The books that are currently in existence in relation to this subject of Kincora, all of them draw on similar sort of themes and parallels and have similar findings. The difference between this one is that it centres around a doctor, the most trusted professional in most people's lives, and someone who specifically treated children. And the fact that they are still alive, and yet there has never been any state apology for their perverse activities and crimes against children. So, I mean, ultimately, I'd like to see compensation, an apology, legal changes in terms of the law so that safeguards are stronger, and also prosecutions of those who were involved in this. And as much transparency as is possible, really.
Yeah, there has to be oversight for these, because you hear about it over and over. It's constant, Even here in the States, the OSU, the Ohio State University scandal, where no oversight. The dean of the school, the people, the chairs of the school were allowing these men to just go in there and shower with these young athletes. Just fascinating. That the one topic everyone is so outraged about, allegedly anyway, that we do the least to prevent or to bring justice for these kids.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because essentially it would all point back to home in terms of when I say that, in that it would, who sets the terms of reference for these things? The government, and you'll often find that quite a lot of the evidence points to people on the government payroll having been involved in quite a lot of this. Yeah. Well, it's compromising for them.
Donal Lavery, thank you so much. The book is called The Demon Doctor, British Intelligence and Child Sexual Abuse. When the book comes out, we'll have you back on to retell the story here. It'll be out in about 6 months. In the meantime, you can find Donal Lavery on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good night.